Welcome to U.S. History since 1877. In this course, you will survey the major themes, events, and ideas of American history after Reconstruction.
I'm Jordan O'Connell, History and Government instructor at Northeast Iowa Community College. This lecture distills a decade of my written notes taken from Alan Brinkley's The Unfinished Nation, The American Yawp, and our course-assigned OpenStax U.S. History textbook. This lecture focuses on containment, recovery, and the global Cold War system. The core question is this: what does it cost a republic to promise that instability in Greece, Berlin, Korea, or China now counts as part of American security? The core competency is to explain how post-war events in nations such as Korea, Vietnam, China, and Cuba influenced American fears of a global communist threat emerging from the Soviet Union. What does it cost a republic to promise that instability in Greece, Berlin, Korea, or China now counts as part of American security? World War II left the United States and the Soviet Union stronger than any other powers without leaving them a shared plan for the post-war order. Soviet influence in Eastern Europe, disputes over Germany, atomic rivalry, and European economic ruin pushed American officials to search for a durable strategy that would not repeat the cycles of demobilization and improvised intervention that had marked the interwar years. George F. Kennan's Long Telegram in 1946 and his 1947 X article offered containment as that framework. Patient resistance to Soviet expansion backed by political steadiness and strong institutions rather than by one final showdown. The idea translated broad fear into method, but method alone could not stabilize Greece, revive Western Europe, or reassure allies that American protection would remain in place. That is why the early Cold War became an exercise in institution building. Security was no longer treated as something activated only when war arrived. It became a standing condition requiring appropriations, intelligence offices, recovery plans, treaties, command structures, and recurring congressional support. Once containment took that form, the argument was no longer whether the United States would act abroad. It was how much permanent apparatus the promise would require. The first major test came in the Eastern Mediterranean. Britain informed the United States in February 1947 that it could no longer afford large-scale support for Greece and Turkey. Greece faced a civil war involving a royalist government and communist-led insurgents. Turkey confronted Soviet pressure over the Straits and broader security concerns. Truman asked Congress for aid in March 1947 and framed the request in universal language. The United States, he said, must support free peoples resisting armed minorities or outside pressure. Congress approved roughly $400 million in military and economic assistance for Greece and Turkey. This was more than regional relief. It signaled that the United States would treat local instability as part of a wider ideological contest. Economic recovery in Western Europe soon became the next arena. Secretary of State George C. Marshall proposed a recovery program in June 1947 because food shortages damaged transport, currency instability, and industrial collapse threatened both political order and democratic legitimacy. The European Recovery Program, commonly called the Marshall Plan, sent more than $13 billion between 1948 and 1952 to participating states. Distribution required cooperation through the Organization for European Economic Cooperation, national planning offices, shipping arrangements, and congressional appropriations. Aid paid for machinery, fuel, grain, fertilizers, and industrial rebuilding. It also encouraged currency reform, productivity campaigns, and trade revival within Western Europe. The Marshall Plan treated prosperity as a security tool. Communist parties in France and Italy drew strength from post-war hardship, labor unrest, and doubts about liberal governments. American officials believed that economic collapse could carry countries into the Soviet orbit without a Soviet army crossing a border. Recovery, therefore, became a front of containment. Dollars, wheat, locomotives, and industrial equipment served strategic ends. The institutional result was equally important. Congress accepted large peacetime foreign appropriations, executive agencies coordinated long-distance reconstruction, and American business, shipping, and diplomacy became tightly linked to European stabilization. Aid distribution followed a measurable pattern rather than a vague promise. Britain received the largest single share, followed by France, Italy, and West Germany, while smaller allocations supported the Netherlands, Belgium, Austria, Greece, Turkey, and other participating states. Recipient governments submitted requests, coordinated import schedules, and used counterpart funds within domestic recovery plans. American administrators tracked tonnage, shipping space, and industrial priorities because the program had to move coal, wheat, machine tools, and transport equipment where bottlenecks were most severe. Containment through recovery therefore meant accounting systems and port timetables as much as speeches about freedom.
The Berlin crisis of 1948-1949 added another dimension. When the Soviet Union blockaded land access to West Berlin, the United States and Britain responded with the Berlin Airlift. Cargo aircraft delivered coal, flour, medicine, and basic supplies into the city for almost a year. The operation showed that containment could also work through sustained logistics rather than direct combat. Aircraft scheduling, air corridors, maintenance crews, and round-the-clock delivery turned political resolve into physical survival. The airlift strengthened Western confidence and prepared the ground for a more formal alliance. By the high point of the airlift in 1949, aircraft were landing in Berlin at intervals measured in minutes, and monthly deliveries ran into the hundreds of thousands of tons. C-47s handled early runs, but larger C-54 Skymasters became the real workhorses once planners recognized the scale of coal and food required to keep the city functioning. Tempelhof, Gatow, and later Tegel had to operate with disciplined approach corridors, weather forecasting, ground unloading crews, and rapid turnaround routines. The point was not symbolism alone. If Berlin could be supplied in spite of blockade, then containment had shown that logistics and political will could hold territory without immediate battlefield escalation. The North Atlantic Treaty of April 1949 created the most durable institutional expression of early containment. The treaty bound the United States, Canada, and Western European states into a collective defense arrangement. Article 5 declared that an armed attack against one member in Europe or North America would be considered an attack against all, with each member taking action it deemed necessary, including armed force. The wording preserved constitutional procedures for each state, yet its political meaning was unmistakable. The United States had accepted a permanent peacetime alliance after generations of caution about entangling commitments. Alliance soon meant planning staffs, standardization, basing, command coordination, and later the appointment of Eisenhower as Supreme Allied Commander Europe. At the same moment, the global map was shifting. In 1949, Mao Zedong's Communist Party won the Chinese Civil War and established the People's Republic of China. American politicians and commentators began speaking of the loss of China, language that treated another country's revolution as evidence of American failure. That phrase intensified domestic pressure on policymakers. No administration wanted to appear passive if another crisis seemed likely to expand communist influence. The Soviet atomic test in August 1949 reinforced the sense that time was narrowing and that American strategic monopoly had ended. NSC-68, completed in 1950, responded by arguing for a far larger military posture. It depicted the Cold War as a comprehensive struggle requiring political resolve, alliance maintenance, and major growth in defense spending. The document did not create militarization by itself, but it supplied a blueprint for sustained rearmament. Containment was now tied to bomber fleets, conventional force readiness, intelligence systems, and research spending. The National Security Act of 1947 had already created the Department of Defense, the National Security Council, and the CIA. NSC-68 gave those institutions a broader budgetary rationale. The National Security Act deserves attention because it reorganized the federal state for permanent rivalry. The War and Navy departments were combined into the National Military Establishment, later renamed the Department of Defense. The Air Force became a separate service. The National Security Council linked military, diplomatic, and intelligence discussions in a standing policy forum, while the CIA institutionalized continuous collection and covert analysis. These changes meant that containment could be processed daily by permanent offices rather than only by temporary wartime bodies. Structure preceded crisis, and crisis then justified larger structure. NATO added a comparable layer on the alliance side. Article 5 declared collective defense, but practical credibility required integrated planning, interoperable weapons, standardized procedures, shared exercises, and a command structure that could move divisions and air wings under common direction. When Eisenhower became the first Supreme Allied Commander Europe in 1951, the alliance gained a military headquarters at Shape and a clear expectation that American officers, bases, and appropriations would remain embedded in European defense. A treaty clause had become barracks, runways, supply depots, and command maps. The Korean War converted that rationale into action. On June 25, 1950, North Korean forces crossed the 38th parallel and invaded South Korea. Truman chose to respond under United Nations authority after the Security Council, in the temporary absence of the Soviet delegate, called for member assistance. American troops, ships, and aircraft moved quickly into the conflict. General Douglas MacArthur's amphibious landing at Incheon in September 1950 reversed the collapse around the Pusan perimeter, but the war widened when Chinese forces entered after UN troops moved north toward the Yalu River. Truman rejected MacArthur's calls for wider war against China and dismissed him in April 1951, defending civilian control and the principle of limited war. Korea also transformed budgets. NSC 68 had argued in the spring of 1950 for dramatic defense expansion, but the invasion supplied the political force that paper alone lacked. Military appropriations climbed sharply, conventional rearmament accelerated, and Western European defense planning gained urgency because officials feared that a move in Asia might coincide with pressure in Europe. Containment ceased to mean selective aid and advisory missions alone. It now meant standing readiness across multiple theaters, backed by peacetime taxation and recurring congressional appropriations, large enough to sustain a national security state. Korea globalized containment in practice. It linked treaty credibility, Asian security, UN procedure, military budget expansion, and presidential war-making in one crisis. Rearmament accelerated. NATO planning deepened. U.S. troops remained stationed abroad in large numbers. A doctrine first applied to Greece and Turkey had become a worldwide security commitment backed by permanent force. In March 1947, Truman went before Congress asking for money, advisors, and political backing for Greece and Turkey, but the sentence he chose was built to travel far beyond the Eastern Mediterranean. The United States, he said, must support free peoples, resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or by outside pressures. Those words were drafted for a chamber that controlled appropriations, yet they were also drafted for headlines, embassy cables, and future crises. Free peoples gave the request moral breadth. Attempted subjugation made local instability legible as an American problem. That phrasing was the weapon. A legislator voting on aid for police salaries, road repair, grain shipments, or military training could now describe the expenditure as part of a global struggle rather than a provincial intervention. The doctrine fused moral language to fiscal commitment and made appropriation sound like principle. It also widened the map. Once officials learned to classify many conflicts through that vocabulary, they could flatten the differences among civil war, decolonization, insurgency, and direct Soviet pressure. Greece, Berlin, China, and Korea were not the same crisis, but this language encouraged Washington to place them in one ideological file. The rest of the containment state then grew around that opening script. The Marshall Plan supplied dollars, technical missions, and production targets. NATO supplied treaty language, integrated planning, and Article 5 obligations. Korea supplied battlefield proof that containment could involve major combat without a formal declaration of war. Truman's March 1947 words carried force because they were chosen in a room where budgets, treaties, and deployments all begin. The speech made a regional request sound universal, and that choice helped turn a Mediterranean emergency into a standing grammar for global intervention. By the early 1950s, containment had become a system. Congress funded regular foreign aid. The executive branch coordinated intelligence and diplomacy through standing agencies. Western Europe was tied to the United States through supply and treaty structures, and high defense budgets became normal even outside declared total war. Troop deployments, basing arrangements, and research spending were no longer temporary exceptions. They were part of ordinary governance. The domestic consequences were substantial. Anti-communism shaped loyalty programs, investigations, and public culture, while the fear of weakness abroad narrowed the political room for dissent at home. Korea, China, and later crises made it easier to portray disagreement as risk. Universities, shipyards, aircraft firms, electronics contractors, and laboratories were drawn into a security economy sustained by recurring appropriations and long-term federal demand. Internationally, the same system widened expectation as well as leverage. NATO made Europe a treaty theater. The Marshall Plan tied recovery to American leadership, and Korea showed that an Asian conflict could trigger large-scale U.S. war under UN authority. By the time crises later broke in Cuba and Vietnam, the pathways for response already existed in budgets, commands, alliance routines, and intelligence structures. That is why containment leaves a difficult closing question instead of a stable answer. Once a democracy organizes itself for permanent global vigilance, withdrawal becomes politically and institutionally harder than extension. The unresolved judgment is whether the United States built a necessary shield against Soviet power or a standing apparatus that made every distant crisis look like a test it could no longer refuse.
If you're curious how I'm using AI to build these lectures and reshape higher education, visit thelibertytolearn.com. I'll see you in class.